The Trail of Tears, 1838. The morning began with a light fog that seemed to hold its breath. In a small valley, a bird called once and then grew quiet. Across many homelands in the southeast, families of the Cherokee, Muskogee, Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Seminole peoples woke to days that would not be ordinary. Soldiers and officials were arriving. Papers had been signed in distant rooms. The words on those pages said that the people must leave. They would be taken to a far place across the Mississippi River, a place they had not chosen, a place marked on government maps as Indian Territory. The air felt heavy, as if the trees themselves understood what was happening and could do nothing to stop it. For generations, these nations had lived among rivers that curved through forests and fields. They planted corn, beans, and squash in careful rows, and tended orchards that gave fruit in the fall. Towns rose with council houses where leaders met to consider questions of law and life. There were schools where children learned in native languages and in English. There were printing presses, like the Cherokee Press, that set syllabary into type to share news and law. There were written constitutions and courts organized under elected leaders. Families cared for gardens and fences. Hunters learned the paths of deer and the seasons of fish. The land and the people knew each other well. But pressure grew as non-native settlers moved south and west, eager for land. New states drew lines on maps and passed laws that ignored the sovereignty of native nations. When gold was found in the Cherokee Nation, demands for land swelled like a river after storms. In Washington City, lawmakers argued. Presidents spoke of removal as if it were a simple policy that could make space for everyone. Yet a policy is not a winter road. A policy is not the weight of a child lifted onto a wagon while a grandmother's grave stands behind the house. Policies are made of words. The road would be made of steps. Leaders of native nations tried every lawful path to defend their people. They went to U.S. courts, and some decisions recognized their rights. They sent delegates to Congress and wrote petitions signed by thousands. They said treaties must be honored, and that their nations had the right to govern themselves as they chose. They asked to be left to their farms, their schools, their councils, and their prayers. But paper victories could not stop state laws that pressed forward, nor could they move federal officers who would not enforce the court's words. The ground of law bent under the weight of power. Treaties were pushed through under pressure and confusion. Some were signed by a few people under strain, not by lawful leaders, others were made with threats nearby, or with hunger already in the room. The Treaty of New Echota was one of these. Many Cherokee did not accept it. They said it did not speak their will. Even so, the treaty was used as a key to open the door to removal. Time ran out on arguments. Soldiers came to gather families and bring them to stockades, the first stops on a journey that would be long and hard. The stockades stood where fields had grown and where schools had stood. Now they were fenced spaces with watchful guards. Families arrived with small bundles. Some held quilts folded tight. Some carried a bag of cornmeal, a pot, a Bible, or a medicine bundle wrapped in cloth. Parents counted children again and again as they stood in lines. Elders kept their dignity as best they could, sitting on logs with hands folded in their laps. The air smelled of dust, wood smoke, and worry. People spoke softly and waited for orders they had not chosen to follow. The first groups moved by river and road. Boats carried some along the Tennessee and Ohio, then down the Mississippi. Others walked in long lines along wagon tracks. The seasons turned while the removal continued. In warm months, heat pressed on the travelers and made water precious. In cold months, ice formed along creek edges and stiffened blankets at dawn. Rain turned roads to thick clay that clung to shoes and wheels. Wind carried grit into eyes and mouths. The land itself did not hate them, but it did not make their going easy. On the road, community became a shield. People shared what they could. A mother with a little more corn made thin gruel and passed a wooden spoon to a neighbor's child. A man whose boots still held together carried another person's bundle for a mile and then another. Women tied strips of cloth around ankles to keep raw skin from tearing more. When someone fell behind, a hand reached back. When someone wept, a blanket was lifted to give privacy and quiet comfort. At night, when the campfires burned low, someone told a short story from home, a story of a river bend or a good harvest, and for a few minutes the road fell away. Leaders organized detachments so that order would hold. Captains counted people each morning and each evening. Wagons were assigned for the elderly and the ill, though there were never enough places. Doctors did what they could. Traditional healers did what they could. Both kinds of care mattered, and both had limits. Fever moved along the line like a shadow. Coughs kept people awake. There were graves dug along the route for those who did not make it farther. People gathered around those graves and prayed in voices that rose and fell with the wind. Names were spoken so they would not be lost. Rations arrived from contractors who did not always keep their promises. When flour was short, some scraped acorns and leached them in water, remembering older ways to make bitter food gentle. When meat was thin, hunters slipped into the trees at first light to try for rabbits or deer. Sometimes soldiers helped. There were men among them who looked at the faces in the line and felt a shame they could not quite name, and they brought what small kindness they could find. Others kept their eyes hard and their voices firm. The same road held both kinds. Children learned the new rhythm faster than adults. They counted steps and named creeks. They noticed where a wagon wheel would splash and learned to jump away in time. They learned the distances between water sources and how to sleep through noise. They also learned to laugh when something unexpected broke the gray line of the day, a tumble of puppies from a farmyard, a bird that hopped near the path, a swirl of leaves that landed on a soldier's hat and made him look surprised. Even on a hard road, a small laugh could lighten a mile. The journey did not belong to one people alone. Each of the 5 nations faced removal in its own time and way. The Choctaw departures began earlier, in winter, when cold took its toll and ice made rivers cruel. Their letters home warned others of hunger and frostbite and grief. The Chickasaw left under terms of sale they tried to negotiate, carrying coin and worry in equal measure. The Muskogee Creek had been pushed earlier by conflict and partial removals. Many were already west before 1838. The Seminole fought in the swamps and hammocks of Florida, refusing removal in long resistance. Some were forced out, others remained. The Cherokee removals in 1838 and 1839 were among the most widely recorded, and their story is often told to stand for many. General Winfield Scott was sent to oversee the Cherokee process. He wrote orders that called for humanity and discipline, but orders on paper met the rough edges of real roads and mixed motives. Some detachments were delayed and some were rushed. Some officers were careful and fair. Others proved harsh or careless. When the Cherokee Nation was allowed to organize its own detachments under Principal Chief John Ross, the groups moved with better care. People were given time to gather belongings. Families traveled together. The days were still long and hard, but the steps were more orderly and the sick received more attention. It is important to say what was lost and also what was carried. People left behind ancestral homes, council houses, schools, fields, and places of burial. They left orchards they had planted and tools shaped to their hands. They left rivers whose banks had known their footsteps since childhood. But they carried languages, songs, stories, skills, and the memory of how to live together. They carried the ways to plant and to build, to teach children, to hold councils, and to resolve disputes. They carried faith in their ceremonies and in their prayers. A nation is more than buildings and fences. It is people who keep each other. Along the road, small acts became anchors. A grandmother stitched beads into a pattern she remembered from her own mother and showed a child how to make the same pattern later. A father taught a son to mend a shoe with a curved needle and coarse thread, so that walking would hurt less tomorrow. A group paused by a river and let the children play on the bank for a few minutes more than the schedule allowed. A woman kept the seeds of an heirloom corn in a small pouch and guarded it as if it were a book of law. These acts did not change the road, but they kept the people steady on it. The land they traveled through varied like the moods of the sky. There were stretches of red clay and bare trees, then long green flats, then hills that rolled like old waves. There were rivers, some shallow and bright, some deep and brown. When they crossed, cold water gripped legs and made teeth chatter. When they camped, smoke rose thinly and drifted away in narrow lines. People learned to sleep anywhere, in wagons on hard boards, on the ground under a quilt, beside a small fire that fought the wind and held its ground. Time on the march was measured in simple units: the next creek, the next day, the next county line, the next ration wagon, the next message from ahead. Leaders tried to keep spirits from breaking by marking small milestones. Tomorrow we reach the big river. Another week and the roads turn better. These were not tricks. They were hopes, and sometimes they were true. When they were not, people moved anyway, because they had to. The habit of putting one foot ahead of the other became a kind of promise made fresh each morning. Illness behaved like weather. It arrived, stayed, and left at its own pace. Fevers rose in one tent and then in another. Coughs raked lungs, and sometimes a voice simply faded over days until there was no more sound. Healers brewed teas and laid poultices made from local plants. Doctors set bones, bled patients when they believed it would help, and pulled bad teeth. Many recovered. Some did not. Graves grew along the trail like a second, quieter line of travel. People spoke the names of the dead so those names would not be lost to the wind. In some towns along the route, local people watched the detachments pass. Some looked away. Some brought water and bread. A few opened barns during storms and swept out a space for families to sleep. A smaller number mocked or tried to profit. The world holds both kinds of witness. One store owner who gave flour later told his children that it had felt like the simplest thing in the world, but he saw how much it meant to the people who took that bread. Small kindness has a way of growing larger in memory because it meets a moment that needs it. The crossing of the Mississippi was a turning point. For some detachments the river was calm, for others it was wide with winter and moody with ice. Rafts and ferries creaked and groaned. People watched the water with wary eyes and held small hands tightly. When the far bank came closer and the ramp rose underfoot, some felt their fear ease just a little. They were not home. But they had reached the land where this road would end. The sky seemed larger there. The wind carried a different scent. Indian territory lay ahead, a place marked on maps with lines that did not show its heart. It held prairies and timber, creeks and small hills, wide skies, and winds that could change an afternoon. It also held the earlier removals, the families who had gone before and begun again. Some had built cabins. Some had planted. Some had established new council houses and schools. The land was strange and also capable of becoming familiar. People looked around and asked where springs were, where the soil was dark, and where the winter winds could be broken by a grove of trees. When detachments reached their destinations, exhaustion and grief did not end. They changed shape. A first task was to gather everyone again, to see who had made it and who had not. Names were read with steady breaths. Tears came in quiet rooms and fell on wooden floors. Then there was work that could not wait: shelter, firewood, water, food, and fences. People who had been teachers organized lessons. People who had been leaders called councils. People who had been builders cut logs and raised walls. Days formed around chores and care. Newspapers of the time carried notices about the removals. Letters crossed the miles with news of survivors and the dead. Preachers in distant cities gave sermons and then returned to other topics. Politicians argued about progress. But in the new towns of Indian Territory, the people who had walked simply kept living. They cooked, washed, mended, taught, planted, and planned. They held ceremonies to bless new houses and to remember old ones. They said, "We are still here," not as a shout, but as a steady fact. The sentence itself became a kind of roof. Years turned. Children born on the road grew into adults who remembered only pieces of the journey: cold water around their knees, a wagon's rattle, a voice singing in a language that tasted like home. Some of those children became leaders. They remembered that strength can be quiet. They helped write new constitutions for their nations in the West. They re-established courts and schools. They printed newspapers again. The Cherokee Phoenix found a new press. The Muskogee rebuilt councils. The Choctaw and Chickasaw restored their governments and planned for roads, farms, and academies. The Seminole continued their difficult work of community and balance. Life did not return to what it had been, but it continued, and it sent roots into new ground. Looking back, people would say that the Trail of Tears was not a single road but many roads. It was not one winter but several seasons in which weather took its share. It was not one nation but many, each with its own language, customs, and decisions. It was not only the Cherokee, though their story is often the first that school children learn. It was a broad removal policy that forced many nations west under a single heavy idea, that native peoples must move to make room for others. That idea caused deep harm, and its effects reached into the lives of descendants who would be born long afterward. Yet there is this, too: communities endured. Songs were sung again. Dances were danced again. Seeds from small pouches grew in new soil. Medicine people learned the plants of the prairie and found familiar herbs along creek banks. Art carried patterns forward in beadwork and carvings. Names for places settled on new streams and ridges. Children learned in homes and in schools, in English and in their own languages, even when pressure pressed against native words. Elders told stories in the evenings and children, despite long days of chores, listened with care. A culture is a living thing, and it kept breathing. To remember the Trail of Tears today, it helps to picture a single evening along the way. A fire burns low. A grandmother sits with a child and teaches a song under her breath, repeating the lines until they feel firm. A man comes back to camp with a rabbit and shares it with 3 families. A woman opens her pouch and counts a few corn kernels, then ties the string again and tucks it away. 2 friends look up and find the North Star. They note the direction of the wind. A baby sleeps, warm against a mother's chest. A guard shifts his weight and stares into the dark. The road waits for morning, and so do the people, gathering enough quiet to face another day. The land remembers. Trails that were once dust are now roads. Fields that were once crossed by long lines now hold houses, schools, and pastures. Yet in the quiet of early morning, you can still stand in places along those routes and feel a weight in the air, a careful attention that asks for respect. Travelers stop and read small signs. Descendants gathered to mark days of remembrance. Teachers bring students and speak softly. People walk a stretch in silence and listen for what cannot be heard with ears alone. The ground holds old footsteps and does not forget them. To understand a history like this is to hold two truths at once: great harm was done, and great strength met it. The harm must be named clearly. The strength must be honored without pretending it made the harm small. Both belong in the story. Both shape the way we live now. When we tell the story plainly, we make room for justice and for care, and we make it harder for such harm to hide inside fine words. In the end, what endures is not only the record of distance walked or the list of names signed. What endures is the clear knowledge that a people can carry their heart across a continent, not because they wanted to, but because they had to, and because they would not let go of one another. What endures is the memory of kindness offered at hard times, a cup of water, a place near the fire, a hand steadying a step. What endures is the steady work of rebuilding in a new land while keeping faith with the old. If you are reading or listening at night, you may let this story settle gently. Imagine the last camp on the last evening before the road ended for one detachment. The air is still. A boy runs a stick along a fence rail and stops when his mother calls. A man sets a small pot to boil and drops in 2 handfuls of corn. A girl wraps her arms around a dog's neck and whispers a promise. An elder traces a pattern in the dirt with a finger and then smooths it away. Tomorrow they will step into a place without old footpaths, and begin to make new ones. They will measure the land with careful eyes. They will find where the soil is rich and where a spring runs clear. They will raise walls and hang blankets in doorways, and then they will invite neighbors to share a meal. The footsteps continue in memory, but the walking can rest now. The rivers still run, carrying reflections of sky and trees. The wind still moves in tall grass. The songs still rise, low at first, then stronger, as people teach one another what it means to remember and to remain. The Trail of Tears is a story of loss, and it is also a story of survival and continuity. The land remembers. The people remember. And in that remembering, a quieter strength appears, ready to help the next day begin with steady hands and a promise to care for one another, wherever they live.